Hello everyone, and welcome to my Beyond the Gates official channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Kat sat in the dimly lit living room of Fairmont Crest, the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on her chest like a vice. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the frames as if the house itself were warning her, cautioning her against the path she was trying to avoid. She clenched her hands together in her lap, staring at the floor, her thoughts spiraling in a chaotic storm of what-ifs and fears she couldn't voice. For weeks, the subject of genetic testing had loomed over her life like a shadow she couldn't shake. Chelsea had tried to bring it up gently, speaking in careful tones that made it seem less like an accusation and more like concern, but Kat's mind recoiled at the very idea. She had watched, with a terror that clawed at her stomach, as her friends and family members faced tests that revealed devastating truths. The stories replayed endlessly in her mind. Her cousin, Madison. The way her face had crumpled in despair when the results came back. The whispered conversations in the kitchen she wasn't meant to overhear. The news that spread through the family like wildfire about who carried the cancer gene and who did not. The thought of stepping into that reality herself made her stomach twist with nausea and her hands shake uncontrollably. Kat didn't want to know. She wanted to bury her head, to pretend that this threat didn't exist, that the gene wasn't lurking somewhere inside her, waiting to strike, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing control over her own fate. Every time someone mentioned the possibility of testing, she felt a cold sweat break out along her spine, her heart hammering like a drum. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from imagining the consequences, the worst-case scenarios, the doctor's sterile voice delivering news that would change her life forever. She imagined herself sitting in that office, staring at the result sheet, her life unraveling in seconds, everything she had built and fought for overshadowed by the cruel hand of fate. She had seen it happen before. She had lived through the fear of it secondhand, and that had been enough to leave scars she wasn't ready to confront. Even Marcel, who loved her deeply and who had been unwavering in his support, couldn't pull her out of the spiral she had fallen into. He had tried reasoning with her, reminding her that knowledge was power, that early detection could save her life, that she owed it to herself to face the truth, but she had only shaken her head, a hollow, fearful laugh escaping her lips. "I don't want to know, Marcel," she had whispered the first time he brought it up, her voice breaking, trembling, a mixture of defiance and despair. I can't handle it." And even as the words left her mouth, she felt a surge of guilt wash over her, a guilt that pressed down like a heavy stone, making it difficult to breathe. Because she knew that people loved her, that people wanted her to take this step, and she was letting fear dictate her choices. Fear that was irrational yet all-consuming, fear that told her that knowing could only bring pain. She thought about her mother, the quiet moments they had shared when Kat was a child, the stories of resilience and hope that now seemed fragile and distant, stories she clung to in desperate attempts to fortify herself against the storm she sensed approaching. But the more she tried to summon courage, the more her mind betrayed her, filling with visions of hospital rooms, harsh fluorescent lights, the clinical scent of antiseptic, and the inevitable heartbreak that came with discovering a hereditary disease that could strike at any time. She imagined watching her body become a battlefield, every symptom amplified by the knowledge of what might be waiting, every ache and pain dissected under the lens of genetic inevitability. And she couldn't shake the memory of past tragedies, friends and relatives who had suffered silently, their lives consumed by disease before they had the chance to truly live. Kat's fear wasn't just about herself. It was about the ripple effect, the chain reaction of grief and loss that would follow if she were to be diagnosed. She felt trapped, caught between the desire to live fearlessly and the instinct to protect herself by pretending the danger didn't exist. Nights were the worst. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the gene lurking in her DNA, thinking of the possibility that every moment of joy could be overshadowed by looming illness. Sleep offered no escape. It was punctuated by nightmares where she faced doctors delivering verdicts that crushed her spirit, where she watched her loved ones struggle alongside her, helpless to prevent the inevitable. Even the simplest interactions carried the weight of her secret fear. When Chelsea mentioned genetic testing casually, her stomach dropped. When Marcel suggested a doctor's appointment, a wave of panic surged through her. She found herself making excuses, avoiding conversations, dodging invitations that might lead to discussion, and all the while, the anxiety gnawed at her from within, invisible yet suffocating. Kat knew logically that testing could provide relief, that uncertainty was a heavier burden than the truth, but the emotional toll felt unbearable. She questioned herself constantly, chastising herself for letting fear control her choices, yet powerless to overcome it. There was a part of her, small and fragile, that whispered courage, that reminded her of the lives that could be saved, the hope that could be nurtured with knowledge, yet that voice was drowned out by the roar of terror that filled her mind, a roar that screamed of mortality, of fragility, of everything she couldn't face. And so she remained in limbo, suspended between fear and possibility, each day a battle against the invisible chains of anxiety, each conversation a minefield, each glance a reminder of the secret she carried. Her friends and family, unaware of the depth of her turmoil, urged her gently, coaxed her lovingly, but every attempt was met with polite deflection, small smiles that masked inner chaos, laughter that rang hollow even to her own ears. She avoided mirrors because she couldn't bear the thought of seeing the reflection of someone who might be a carrier, someone whose life could be irreversibly altered by genetic inheritance. She avoided medical shows on television, conversations about hereditary illnesses, even casual news stories about cancer outbreaks, because every story was a trigger, every headline a reminder of the reality she was running from. And yet, there was no escaping it. Every birthday, every family gathering, every holiday was tainted with the specter of what if, the silent question that hung over her head, the fear that she might be next in a line of people touched by tragedy. Kat's internal struggle became a private obsession, a constant mental calculus of risk versus desire, knowledge versus ignorance. She thought of Marcel again, of his unwavering support, of the love that enveloped her even in her darkest moments, and yet even that love could not erase the fear that had taken root in her heart. She wanted to be brave. She wanted to step into the light of truth, but the thought of the results, of the potential heartbreak, paralyzed her. She imagined the relief she might feel if the test came back negative, and the crushing despair if it came back positive, and the weight of both outcomes left her frozen. Kat's fear was not cowardice. It was survival instinct, primal and intense, and she wrestled with the duality of her desires, wanting to know, wanting to live fully, wanting to protect herself from devastation. And so she lingered in shadows, a delicate balance of denial and dread, hiding her thoughts behind smiles, nods, and carefully chosen words, her heart a battlefield of hope and terror. And through it all, she carried a secret burden heavier than anyone could see, the invisible weight of genetic destiny that haunted her every step, her every breath, a shadow that would not lift until she faced the truth she feared more than anything, a truth that promised either liberation or heartbreak, a truth she wasn't yet ready to meet. Kat's nights had grown darker than ever, not because of the absence of light, but because of the oppressive weight of her thoughts, a suffocating, inescapable cloud that clung to her like a second skin, making even the simplest choices feel like monumental feats. She wandered the halls of Fairmont Crest in a daze, the portraits of ancestors staring down at her, silent witnesses to her anxiety, as though they too knew what lay hidden in her DNA, what secret legacy might be passed down to her children, and every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracked windows seemed to echo with the looming question she refused to answer. A question that had become a ghost in her own home, haunting every corner, every shadow, whispering that knowledge was inevitable, that she could run but could never hide from the truth she so desperately wanted to avoid, and she could feel Marcel's presence behind her sometimes, patient, loving, but also frustrated, because he saw through the facade, saw the tremble in her hands, the tight line of her jaw, the way she flinched at the mention of testing, and yet he did not push too Hard, knowing that fear was a cage that could not be broken with gentle persuasion alone, and she resented herself for needing him, yet fearing the step that could save her life. Knowing logically that testing might bring relief, certainty, a path forward, but emotionally, the thought of opening that door was akin to standing on the edge of a cliff, the abyss below filled with worst-case scenarios, every what if, amplified by memories of family members who had carried the gene and succumbed to its consequences, whose lives had been cut short, whose laughter and warmth she remembered and feared might be mirrored in her own future if fate decided to play a cruel hand, and so she avoided calls from doctors, dodged conversations, ignored gentle nudges from friends, and even when she forced herself to sit at the table with Chelsea, the words barely formed, a hollow murmur of false reassurance that she repeated like a mantra to convince herself that the problem did not exist, that it was someone else's burden, someone else's destiny. But inside, panic churned like a stormy ocean, rising with every heartbeat, threatening to drown her in despair, and her thoughts spiraled into the future she dreaded, imagining herself in hospital rooms, facing sterile white walls, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the sterile smell that seemed to steal hope itself, and then she would see her own reflection in the glass of the window late at night, pale and haunted, and she could not tell if it was fear or fate staring back at her, and she imagined Marcel holding her, trying to shield her from the storm of her own mind, his voice soft, but she could hear the tremor of worry that he tried to mask, and she hated herself for causing him anxiety while she herself was paralyzed by terror, imagining the conversations she would have to have, the inevitable disclosure to family members, the way news like this would ripple through their lives, changing dynamics, relationships, perceptions, and she could feel a headache forming, pressing against her temples, a physical manifestation of the psychological war she waged alone. And then came the memory of her own mother, who had once whispered words of strength when Kat was a child. Stories of courage in the face of adversity, but those words felt fragile now, brittle against the storm of her dread, and she wondered how she would survive if the news turned out to be the worst possible outcome, whether she could endure the shame, the grief, the quiet moments where fear would seep into every crevice of her existence. And she thought of her friends who had lost loved ones, of the quiet funerals, the lingering grief, the moments that no one saw when the world carried on outside, and she realized she had been living in a limbo, suspended between ignorance and knowledge, hoping somehow that avoidance could protect her from fate, but knowing deep down that it was only a matter of time before she would have to confront the reality she feared most. And yet, even that realization was not enough to push her forward, to give her the courage to schedule a test, to sit in a sterile office and confront the cold truth, because the mind is clever and cruel, and fear often whispers that denial is safety, that ignoring the threat keeps it at bay, and she clung to that whisper like a life raft in a stormy sea, even as guilt gnawed at her from within, reminding her that those who loved her deserved honesty, that she could not protect them or herself by hiding, and it was in that fragile state of desperation that she received the call, a call that would shatter her fragile equilibrium, a voice on the other end, hesitant and cautious, telling her that her cousin, Madison, had received her genetic test results, and that they were not what anyone had expected, that the gene they feared was present in ways that no one anticipated, and the words struck Kat like a physical blow, her knees buckling, her vision narrowing, and the room spun around her, the wind outside now a roar, matching the storm inside, and for the first time, she felt the sharp edge of reality slicing through the protective bubble she had built around herself, and she realized with a sickening clarity that avoidance was no longer an option, that the secret she had tried to keep at bay had begun to infiltrate every corner of her life, and as she sank into the couch, clutching the phone, tears streaming down her face, a mixture of fear, frustration, and a strange, reluctant clarity washed over her, and in that moment, she made a choice, not because she felt brave, not because she felt ready, but because the world demanded it, because the shadows she had hidden behind had grown too large, too threatening to ignore, and as Marcel rushed into the room, concern etched on his face, he found her trembling, the phone still clutched to her ear, and without words, he wrapped her in an embrace, feeling the weight of her terror press against him, and she cried into his shoulder, a long, wrenching cry of fear, confusion, and helplessness. And in that embrace, she felt the smallest flicker of hope, that perhaps with love, with support, with courage she did not yet feel, she could face the truth, she could confront the possibility of the gene within her, and she could navigate whatever came next. And yet, even as that fragile hope flickered, the phone in her hand buzzed again with another message, another revelation, another hint that the reality she feared was far more complex and tangled than she had imagined. And as she read the words, her mind reeled. The message hinted that not only was the gene present in her family, but there were complications, mutations, probabilities that no one had fully understood, secrets that had been hidden for decades, and Kat realized with a jolt of horror that the very foundation of her family's health history was built on uncertainty, misinformation, and denial. And now, the responsibility fell on her to uncover the truth, to act, to make decisions that could alter the course of her life. And those she loved, and the weight of it pressed down like a physical force, suffocating, unrelenting, but somewhere in that crushing moment, a spark ignited, a fragile ember of resolve, a whisper that perhaps knowledge, terrifying as it was, could also be power, could also be liberation, could also offer a path to survival and protection for those she cared for most. And with that realization, Kat lifted her head, still trembling, still terrified, but for the first time acknowledging that she could not stay hidden forever, that fear alone could no longer dictate her choices. And as Marcel held her, as Chelsea's text messages arrived with encouragement and love, as the world outside continued unabated, she understood that the next step, terrifying, uncertain, and fraught with risk, was inevitable, and she would have to take it, because some truths, no matter how painful, demanded to be faced, and some battles, no matter how terrifying, demanded courage, even when courage felt impossible. Kat felt the room spin around her, the dim light of the Fairmont Crest living room barely holding back the shadows that pressed in from all sides, shadows that mirrored the turmoil in her mind, a chaos that had been building for weeks, months, maybe years, each day a slow burn of dread, each conversation a potential trigger. And now, after the call about Madison's unexpected genetic results, the storm inside her reached a fever pitch, a hurricane of fear, guilt, and anticipation. And she realized that denial had been a fragile barrier, one that shattered the moment reality came knocking, and the thought of facing her own fate, of stepping into the sterile glare of a doctor's office and looking down at a sheet of paper that could change everything, made her knees feel weak, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a drum in the silence of the room. And yet there was a strange clarity in the chaos, a recognition that fear alone could not protect her, that the world and those she loved were moving forward with or without her consent, and she had to act, whether she wanted to or not, because secrets, once revealed, could not be unlearned. And now the ripple of Madison's results threatened to expose more than just genetic truths. It threatened to unravel the fragile fabric of their family entirely, to bring long-buried secrets into the light where no one could hide, not even Kat. And she could feel Marcel's eyes on her, steady and worried, as he reached for her hand, trying to offer comfort, trying to remind her that she was not alone, and she clung to that touch, even as panic gnawed at her from the inside, knowing that the next step would require courage she didn't feel, because testing herself was no longer a choice. It was inevitable, and each passing second of avoidance only made the unknown larger, more terrifying, a looming shadow that swallowed every quiet moment, every attempt at normalcy, every smile she forced onto her face for those around her. And she could hear Chelsea's voice in her head, the gentle insistence that knowledge is power, that ignoring the problem would only magnify it. But even the logic of her friends could not pierce the dense fog of fear that had settled around her heart, a fear that was primal, unrelenting, a constant reminder that mortality was a reality she could not escape, and in that fear lurked another layer of dread, the potential for betrayal, for secrets hidden within the family for decades, secrets that could twist her understanding of who they were, of who she was, And she thought of her mother again, the quiet strength she had admired as a child, the stories of resilience that now seemed fragile, and she wondered how she could summon even a fraction of that courage when faced with the reality that the family history she trusted might be false, manipulated, or worse, intentionally hidden. And her thoughts turned to the others in the family, the whispered rumors she had overheard in kitchens, hallways, and at late-night gatherings, fragments of conversation that hinted at cover-ups, medical mysteries, and legacies that were never meant to see the light of day, and suddenly the possibility of her own diagnosis felt like a spark that could ignite a wildfire, setting off revelations that could consume everyone, changing relationships, loyalties, and perceptions forever, and the thought of it made her heart race, her stomach knot, and her mind reel with the implications. Because in Fairmont Crest, every secret had a price, and every truth, once uncovered, had consequences that could not be undone, and as the fear surged through her, Kat realized that avoidance was no longer possible, that her silence could no longer shield her or her loved ones from the storm approaching, and with trembling hands, she pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the messaging app, knowing that the first step would be to confront the truth not only within herself, but in those around her, to face the realities that had been buried in layers of denial and fear. And as she typed a message to Marcel, telling him that she was ready to make an appointment, the phone buzzed again, a notification from an unknown number, and a chill ran down her spine as she hesitated, her fingers frozen, her mind racing with possibilities of who could be reaching out at this exact moment and why, and with a trembling breath, she opened the message to find a single line of text. "You're not ready for what's coming, Kat. They lied to you about everything." And her heart nearly stopped, the blood draining from her face as the words settled like a stone in her chest, because in that instant, the fear that had been abstract became tangible, immediate, and inescapable.